We're continuing our study this morning of Third John. If anybody missed the class last week, we're studying single chapter books of the Bible. I somewhat randomly started with Third John, not the last one, not the first one. We also covered 3 different random pieces of Bible trivia last week. There are 5 single chapter books in the Bible. Those include Obadiah, Philemon, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. 2 John is the shortest of the single chapter books, and 3 John is the second shortest, just 1 verse longer and a few short words longer. Jimmy offered up that there are only 2 people mentioned in the Bible that walked with God, those being Enoch and Noah. So last week we made it through the first 7 or 8 verses of 3 John. Today we should have a pretty good chance of getting through the rest of 3 John. It's one of the reasons I like these shorter books. Some very brief overview comments about the letter before we get started. The Apostle John wrote this letter. Most believe he wrote it very late in life, likely penned somewhere between 80 and 90 AD, with most in the camp closer to 90 AD. The letter is written to Gaius, but there are also 2 others that are specifically mentioned in the text. Demetrius, like Gaius, is another positive example in the text. And then we have Diotrephes, who we'll talk about today, as an example that we don't want to follow. We noticed last week how highly John must have thought of Gaius. He used words like beloved, joy, and rejoiced a few times in these few short verses. John mentions truth and how Gaius walked in truth, which means that Gaius was living a life pleasing to God. We notice specifically in verse 2 that Gaius' soul prospered. John had received a wonderful report about Gaius from those traveling and evangelizing the Gentiles. Gaius had apparently acted with great love and kindness towards the brethren that were traveling, and this news made its way back to John. We don't know the extent of everything Gaius did for these traveling workers, but we can decipher from John's words that Gaius showed great hospitality to visitors that were in all likelihood strangers. We wrapped up last week noticing that John points out in verse 7 that these workers for the Lord, they took nothing from the Gentiles, those individuals that they were trying to convert. So we made it through verse 7 last week. Today we're going to wrap up the first section of the letter, the first section being verses 1 through 8 that we read last week, and verses 1 through 8 are all focused on Gaius. Before we get started, does anyone need a copy of the questions? I tried to assort it a little bit differently, where there's only a couple on these, 5 in the very back where people like to... Anybody need a copy of the questions? I have a few extra if you do. All right. So let's go ahead and read verse 8. We therefore ought to receive such that we may become fellow workers for the truth. There are 2 fundamental points in this verse. The first half is teaching us that we should support workers like these evangelists. From this very letter, John commends Gaius' support of these brethren. The second half of verse 8 tells us that through this kind of support, then we become fellow workers. So by helping those that spread the gospel message, we're taking part in this honorable work for the Lord. Now, not everybody is in a position to travel abroad preaching the good news, but we should all strive to support these kinds of efforts. So our first question on the sheet, I know it's really early in the class, but I do have one on the sheet related to verse 8. How do we support this type of evangelistic effort today? I like not writing on the board because I can have nested questions within one verse. How do you think Gaius supported this? Was it personally or through his local congregation? And then what is our obligation as individuals?
I think we have a responsibility to support, financially support preacher colleges and the students that go there, and to support financially our ministries. our missionaries in places like Costa Rica and overseas.
Okay. So we have an obligation
We have
to
an
do this.
obligation
Yeah.
to support the ministry, the missions, and the students
Okay. Thanks, Paul. How do we do this today?
through our offering.
Through the offering.
Individually, I mean, if you're going to support somebody individually by actually transferring money through the internet,
Yep. Somebody overseas, maybe. Yep. Yep. Thanks, Diane. So we can do it individually. We can do it through our contribution. Cole, were you?
Time, like helping efforts, planning a year.
Yeah. Not just financially, but also putting in some work with these good works. Tammy?
My dad's little church, there was like 12 people there, and so they kept giving and giving, but they had a lot of money. And so they started supporting Tim, going to Costa Rica. That's why he's went all those years. And that congregation paid his way every year. And
Nice.
stuff. So even, it made them feel good to be able to support because
They were small, but they were able to do a good work like that. Thanks, Tammy.
In Scripture, we read where Christians are to be hospitable, and so that can go in a lot of different ways. But even inviting people into your home, having them stay, like traveling preachers. There's different ways that you can do it. And I think in the first century, a lot of that had to go on because you didn't have the kind of hotels and stuff necessarily that they have today. And so Christians, needed to put up rather than that were traveling.
Right.
I imagine Paul and many of those in the first century had to dwell in brethren's homes and stuff.
And for those that weren't here last week, I knew that it was pretty common that Christians would stay with other Christians as they traveled, but I didn't realize how poor or what places of ill repute those types of public inns really were in the first century. Like you said, you can look at hotels now and does it have 4 stars, 5 stars, whatever. That wasn't the case, obviously, in the first century. And I think specifically in this context, right, Gaius is commended for the hospitality that he showed. And I think that we're all charged and commanded with that.
Another way is prayer.
Prayer. Continue to pray for these efforts.
Pray for all the bishops and evangelists that we support.
Thanks, Tony.
Those personally too.
All right. That wraps up the first part of this short letter. That's really kind of where I wanted to get last week. Now let's move on to the next individual. In verses 9 and 10, John shifts his attention to Diotrephes. We'll go ahead and read both verses 9 and 10. I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does, prating against us with malicious words. And not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. John leads off verse 9 stating that he wrote to the church. Having 3 letters here in the New Testament specifically from John indicates that he wrote to congregations of the Lord's church, likely regularly. In terms of which writing or the specific letter John refers to here in verse 9, that we have no specific evidence of. The letter John alludes to doesn't appear to be any of the epistles that we have in the New Testament. But apparently, he's written to this congregation before. A few things regarding Diotrephes. This happens to be the only place we know of him being mentioned in the New Testament. Based on his name, he was likely a Gentile convert. Diotrephes may have been a deacon or an elder in the congregation, or he might have been a member that was simply trying to exercise authority. John also points out that Diotrephes places importance on position or being someone of authority. The phrase loves to have preeminence that we see there in verse 9 quite literally means one who loves to be first or one who loves to be chief. Again, we don't know if Diotrephes held any type of position in the church or if he was just trying to exercise authority and take charge in some way. And clearly, this is contrary to what Jesus taught. In Matthew 23 and verse 12, we read, "And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Paul also similarly wrote in Romans 12 and verse 10, "Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another." Diotrephes was doing the opposite of what both Jesus and Paul talk about in those two passages. Even if Diotrephes may have been an elder, Peter warns of this type of an approach to the eldership in 1 Peter 5 and verse 3, where Peter writes, "Nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock." Elders are not to lord over the flock or to be overbearing as they oversee the congregation. They need to lead through their good example. The last phrase in verse 9 indicates that Diotrephes does not recognize John's apostolic authority. There seems to be speculation on what exactly John refers to in terms of receiving us. The most logical, I think, and appropriate for this context seems to be this type of a rationale. We just read of Gaius and how John commends him for his great hospitality. Maybe John, through his previous writing, had suggested to Diotrephes that he and or the church there support these traveling evangelists, and Diotrephes elected not to support the traveling evangelists, thus going against John's instruction. Let's look at our second question there. What kind of an influence can someone like Diotrephes have on the church? I had these littered about. I had to pick this morning between breathing through my nose or really, really dry mouth. I've loaded up on pseudoephedrine, so lots of water today.
Pretty bad influence.
Bad influence?
We have brethren today that are marked to split congregations and, just force their own interpretation of the word on the whole congregation.
Bad and can even lead to splits. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.
This reminds me of Pope because, he wants to be first in the Catholic Church. And, it says he won't receive the Christians. Well, the Catholics really don't honor the biblical authority. They don't want their members to read the Bible. So they're doing kind of the same thing.
Leave it to the,
Right.
yeah.
We see where they went. That's a lot.
I didn't think that as a good example. The Pope could be acting just as maybe a Diotrephes. Thanks, Diane. All right, we don't have to belabor that one. Those are really for me to get drinks of water. Moving on to verse 10. Go ahead, Jimmy.
I remember when your father-in-law, Harold, they had trouble down at
Galpolice, yeah.
the church. And he said the night before, he went to the preacher and begged him not to go through with this because he knew that was going to split the church. But the guy went ahead and did it anyway. I'm just saying, when people put themselves above the Lord's church, that's not good.
No. It's a real example of what Jeff was talking about. Yeah.
Yes, and he had the opportunity to change that and to keep the church.
Put the congregation first.
Because of his headstrong and things like that. People, like I say, people put themselves before the church, and we should never do that.
Right.
Should never do anything that would cause dissension in the church.
Denying self. So many times is tough to do. Thanks, Jimmy. Verse 10, I'll read verse 10 again. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. We see, therefore, at the start of verse 10, which obviously ties it back to verse 9, essentially saying because Diotrephes did this, because he did not receive them, as we see in verse 9, John's going to address this directly with Diotrephes when and if he comes. We'll see again in verse 14, John mentions again that he intends to visit this particular church. There's no indication that John is acting with ill intent or malicious words here when he talks about bringing this to Diotrephes' attention. There are specific steps that are outlined that we need to follow when conflict or disagreement arises, especially between brethren. What's the first thing we need to do if a brother or sister sins against us? Actually, let's turn over to Matthew chapter 18. Let's look at Matthew chapter 18. We'll look at verses 15 through 17. Matthew 18, 15 through 17. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. From what we have over in 3 John, it seems to me that John is simply taking this first step that we have in verse 15 here of chapter 18. I'm not on any social media platforms, and honestly, outside of work email, I really don't spend a whole lot of time interacting in a digital way. At any rate, I want to go to another one of our questions in light of John addressing Diotrephes, as well as what we have here in Matthew chapter 18. How does online or digital interaction differ from face-to-face interaction? And then as a society, are we moving, for more or less of this face-to-face interaction? And then longer term, what type of an impact might this have on the church?
I have no experience with this personally, but from what I understand, just talking to people, some folks are prone to be vicious to others and say things on the social media platforms that they wouldn't say to someone directly in front of them.
Thanks, Paul.
I think in the text too, you can't get to the interpretation of the tone behind the text, and either make it become a good result or a bad result. And the person sending the information may have good intentions, but it comes off that it's negative to the person.
And that wasn't necessarily the intent.
Whereas if you're face to face, you can read
how they're coming across and everything.
Yes, exactly.
Carly?
So I have a lot of experience with this. Well, first of all, it does make things very impersonal. With, like you said, you have little keyboard warriors who would say things online, and they would not say things to face. But with our youth especially, who are very online and very interconnected, you see their social skills going down in schools. We don't have a lot of interpersonal skills with our kids. There's a lot more bullying because they're used to being online. And not having that, like especially with their formative years being in COVID, like the age I have right now. All of their classes were online. All of their interactions with people were online. They were stuck inside for a year. That's where they learned how to communicate and in this phase of their life. And so we are having a lot of trouble with just getting kids to interact in a effective and positive manner. On top of that, we talked about, I think it was Dale who said this. It might not have been Dale, but I will attribute it to him.
Okay, Dale gets credit.
Church-wise, you can, I think he said, you can turn a fireplace on the TV and not get warm. And so it's like, we have all these people, I'll just watch church online. I'll just do this online. How are you going to get warm from that? How are you going to be away from that?
That's a great analogy.
That is a great analogy.
So, I think a lot of people, and especially in the schools, because I've known we've had like PDs about this, all this stuff. We are trying to get away from that because we've seen the effect it has. I think society and the general non-face turn of it is pushing more towards like technology.
More virtual.
But I
Yeah.
think people as a whole are pushing more towards face-to-face. And that's not to say that technology doesn't have its benefits, because like, I'd still be single if not for technology. But without it, like, we need to have a better balance, and we need to move more towards face-to-face, because we do need that fireplace, we do need that warmth, and we need to know how to interact with people.
Okay. Jimmy?
The church, when you think of the problems that the church had in Acts 15, there were people, and this could have been what Theophilus was teaching. There were people that were teaching, unless you are circumcised after the law of Moses, you can't be saved. Well, the apostles didn't write a letter and say you shouldn't do that. They went to Jerusalem, they met with them face to face, they worked it out, and then sent letters to the churches telling the churches, don't listen to these people. You're saved because you have been obedient to the gospel. Certain things they were to stay away from. And so John here says, when I come, I'll talk to him face to face. And so we need to solve things, I think, face to face.
Yeah.
That way we know, what's going on. And this stuff over the internet, just it's a useless battle sometimes, because like you say, people will say things there
that they never would when they're, yeah.
And so the problems were met head on. They weren't, done by a letter or anything. They were met personally.
So Carly, it sounds like on the fence in terms of the society that's about us, right? Moving to a virtual versus a face-to-face in person. Do you think that's going to, obviously, I didn't think about COVID, of all things, right? I didn't think of COVID, but, the fireplace analogy is phenomenal. Find out if Dale, otherwise we should give you credit for that, I think. So it wasn't you, you're confident of that. But if we're moving in that direction, what type of an impact can this have on the Lord's church? I mean, I think it's scary. Like you said, there's things that people will say, or you don't know, Lynn, the way you'd started, you don't know the tone of you get all caps, you get lowercase, and you got emojis. That's what you get to pick from.
Since the internet is so prevalent in the homes, what do our kids spend a lot of time on these days? Maybe not in our homes, it's different, but do they get to go outside, or do they want to play on their tablet? Do they want, there's a lot of screen time. Even in the schools, all the schools are done, tests are done online. When you go to apply for a job, you have to apply online. If you want to click coupons, it's online. Also, I notice behavior, especially with people, because they can behave a certain way online, but not in person, and they don't know how to interact. The social skills are down.
Yeah. It's interesting you said the social skills, and Carly, your mention of it as well. I was, last year I think it was, some award ceremony that we went to at the high school. The number of kids that would go up there, they were like, and then they wouldn't even have eye contact with the individual that was handing them the awards. Sometimes the person passing the awards out had to chase them down for a handshake or whatever. And you're talking about like these high school students, and those are the top. Right, those are the top. It was a National Honor Society thing. So I'm like, wow. Tony?
Another thing you and I talked about that could affect the church, the divisiveness of the internet, because of how it can select your interest.
Yep.
Different from someone else's interest. Will slowly start to divide. You'll start getting information just regarding your interests, and same with the other person. Next thing you know, it's dividing us as a church, and that's another thing that could be detrimental.
I mean, there's a lot of evidence in the, there's a really good documentary. I don't remember what it was. It's not what I'm here to share, but how the political divide has even become greater because, at the end of the day, you've got thousands of engineers behind the scenes trying to get more time from your eyeballs to this screen. Social dilemma. Thank you, Carly. Yeah. it's kind of a cool thing. You can't beat 10,000 engineers behind the scenes trying to get more of your eyeballs, and so they continue to polarize the type of content that you have. And so we see it, I believe, in the political arena, at least in my adult life. And the same thing can happen, like you're saying, Tony, within the church.
On a note of that, misrepresentation, I don't know if you guys have seen that commercial from the pastor from the United Church of Christ who says, he's for this abortion issue, and then they show a family holding hands and praying, how you're not going to be judged, it's a family's choice. But it says the Church of Christ, even though it's the United Church of Christ. I don't want to be lumped into that.
Associated with that stance, yeah.
So you can have a lot of misrepresentations, people who don't know what the Church of Christ is, thinking it's the same thing.
They can automatically.
I really don't like that commercial.
Yeah.
Not only, not to go off record or off track here, but with the kids so involved in their phones and everything, you wonder what it does to their mental health.
Yeah.
Because it can cause social anxiety, which is going to keep the kids more away from going to church, going to public places, and getting that social.
And it's interesting, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, there wouldn't probably have been this fear of going and interacting socially, but that is something that a parent will truly have to struggle with.
To what you're saying, when I was in school, I feel like if you had a problem, you went to the school counselor, and now I work at a school, and it's the school counselors, which one do you want to see there? And they're all over the building. There's people we hired with extra funds just to equip the kids to dealing with coming back to school. They learned online for so long, it's all they know. And we've got teachers that even started that are relying on the technology more, and I think there's right ways to do it, and there's wrong ways to do it, to where we're implementing days now, digital detached days, where we're the students aren't allowed to touch anything electronic.
Oh.
If the teacher has their screen on, that's one thing, to just have something on the board to write on, because we don't have whiteboards.
That's cool.
But you're seeing a pushback. When you talked about it being scary, I think there's a larger number of people that are tired of it. I remember my dad started a Facebook account over a decade ago just to connect with one friend. And now we're getting to where we want to just shut it all off. He wants to go to the mountains on vacation. I don't want service anymore. And I used to roll my eyes when I was a teenager and I was addicted to everything. And now I'm like, I want the same thing. I just want to disconnect. And I think we're at a boiling point where people are tired of that. And I think that's why, at least in my school, kids were excited to come back and see their friends and not be stuck behind the screen. And it's exciting to be back in church, but it's really easy, when you're feeling kind of sick or not too great to just say, oh, well, I can just watch it online. It's so tempting. But I think it's good to push back against these things. You were saying, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too far, but all of the entertainment that we have now, it was pitched to us like it's to connect with people and to grow socially, but it's all engineered and designed to make us feel more alone so that we're more dependent on it. They've tested back as early as 2010 if they had the ability to swing elections, and they were saying what the percentage of how they could change how you think. So we just have to be mindful of where we're spending our time and where we're spending our time in person, because our time in person is way more meaningful than what we're going to have online, no matter what it is.
And from a church standpoint, and this is just my little 2 cents more, we were talking about social media and how we do reach a massive audience. If we have a very good post on our church social media, we can reach out to 1,000 people, and 1,000 people will see that post.
Right.
But I think it's still true where if we have a gospel meeting, I can make a Facebook event, I can post about it, I can do all I want. But the most effective way to get people there is by
inviting personally. Yep.
So we share it, so it's out there, the news is out there, and it's good to share, and it's good to get 1,000 people to see, because that may be 1,000 people you wouldn't talk to every day. But if you have that opportunity to talk to someone, you should still do it.
The people that you're personally, exactly.
It's a great add-on tool, not a substitute.
All right, let's get back to our text in verse 10. The next thing we see is this phrase, prating against us. I looked at a few different translations, and most of them use prating. I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever used this word until teaching this class. I felt a little better about myself and my vocabulary when this MacBook itself, didn't even recognize prating. So I learned that the word prate occurs no place else in the New Testament. The word is based on a Greek root word that means flow. The idea here being someone that overflows with talk, to talk without getting to the point, to go on endlessly with little or no purpose. It made me think of the congressional act of filibuster. There's no language connection to filibuster. That's just what popped into my head while I was studying this verse. The idea of prating has no specific negativity associated with it, but next we see in verse 10 that Diotrephes was doing this with malicious words. Running on and on by itself can be harmless, but in this instance we see that Diotrephes was using evil, wicked, or malicious words against John. There are two sentences or two statements written in verse 10. So far we've understood that John plans to address Diotrephes face to face when and if he comes to this congregation. We've learned that Diotrephes has been professing malicious words against John, or more specifically, opposing John's authority. Now, the second half of verse 10 starts off that Diotrephes wasn't content with just opposing and talking openly bad about John. The second half of verse 10 takes it a step further. In this second sentence, there are three major things. Diotrephes does not follow John's instruction himself by not receiving the brethren. He forbids others from receiving these brethren. And he takes it a step further by putting people out of the church. Most of those three teachings in the second half of verse 10 are fairly straightforward, except for who them refers to. Them could refer to the traveling brethren. Them could also refer to those within this particular congregation that were willing to help those traveling. I tend to think it refers to those traveling brethren not being welcomed or received at this particular congregation. The reason I fall into this particular camp is primarily because one of the focuses in this short letter relates to the kindness and the hospitality shown by Gaius. I also think that if putting them out of the church referred to withdrawing fellowship from a brother, then in this instance, Gaius, of all people, would have been withdrawn from. So, at any rate, one lesson we can take away from verses 9 and 10 is the amount of negative influence one person can have within the body of Christ. Let's turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I was actually going to ask a question about this section that Paul writes. I didn't put it on the sheet, but thought we could just turn there together. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And let's read the first 5 verses of 1 Corinthians 5. Paul there writes, "It is actually reported to me that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality as is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. And you are puffed up, and have not rather mourned, that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. For I indeed, as absent in body, but present in spirit, have already judged, as though I were present, him who has done this deed. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, when you are gathered together, along with my spirit, with the power of our Lord Jesus Christ, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord Jesus." So my question here is, do you think these two scenarios, the individual that was in the sexually immoral situation and Diotrephes, do you think these scenarios are similar or different? The reason I turn to this is Paul obviously is writing to the Corinthian church and notes there in verse 3, he's absent in body. John was also absent in body. So are these scenarios similar or different? And why?
Well, it seems to be here in 1 Corinthians that there was an individual that may not have been in such a high esteem position in the church, and leaders were not taking action that they should have here in 1 Corinthians, whereas there in 3 John, this Diotrephes, maybe he was a prominent person in the church, and maybe the congregation felt, kind of held captive by his leadership or whatever the case may be. So could be different in that sense.
That Diotrephes may have been a leader. This individual is probably not a leader, just involved in some sexual immorality, and the leadership at that respective congregation in Corinth was not addressing the situation. Okay? Other ways? Similar? Different?
Well,
The sin's a sin, so in both scenarios, it's give the sin back to Satan, give the soul back to Christ.
Okay.
Is the answer.
Both in a sinful situation, no doubt about that. Definitely similar in that regard. Paul?
that's,
Okay.
Similar in the fact that they were having a heavy influence
On the congregation,
in a negative
yeah.
way.
So one individual can have a really, really big impact on a specific congregation. The fundamental difference that I noted was that John maybe wants to handle the situation. Maybe he even wants to persuade Diotrephes to change his ways. Maybe Diotrephes could come around. He wants to have this face-to-face interaction. In our 1 Corinthians case here in chapter 5, Paul's already judged the matter, and he's instructing the church there to handle the situation, which is kind of what you were alluding to, John. Anyways, back over to 3 John. Any other comments on Diotrephes? That's all the commentary I have on our second character. If not, we're going to move on to the next couple of verses, and we'll talk about Demetrius. Let's read verses 11 and 12. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God. Demetrius has a good testimony from all and from the truth itself, and we also bear witness, and you know that our testimony is true. We see this familiar phrase, beloved, to start verse 11. John pivots or transitions from using this phrase in the first part of 11 to compare or contrast the evil example of Diotrephes to the positive example of Demetrius. Not only is this a transition, but it's also a command and teaching that we need to be following. I think it's easy to understand what John is putting forth here. Don't follow, imitate, or act in evil ways, rather one that's good and honest and true things. Stepping back a moment and getting more specific with our letter and the context, remember that John is writing to Gaius, and in writing specifically to Gaius, he mentions these two other individuals. He mentions Diotrephes and the terrible or the evil example that he was. And then in verse 12, John writes of Demetrius as a good example. John here uses Demetrius, but this kind of using someone as an example is pretty common in the New Testament. Paul even offered himself up in a number of his letters to different congregations. In 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, Paul writes, imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. And then in Philippians 4 and verse 9, he writes, the things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. I'll pause there before we jump into our verse 12 and ask our next question. So John holds Demetrius up as an example. Paul also wrote of following his Christ-like example. How do we utilize others, contemporary figures in this day and age, the way both John and Paul wrote of in their respective letters? Do we do this kind of thing anymore? Should we do this kind of thing anymore? That's a yes or no question. That's not the best for discussion, but...
No, if I'm right or wrong, we have guest preachers periodically that the eldership endorses.
Okay. Or Carly mentioned Dale Jenkins, right? I mean, that's somebody that we have. If that was his example, it was a great example that he shared. analogy. John?
I listened to a podcast. It's called the Godly Young Men podcast. And there were a couple different episodes where one of them was talking about someone who was not really a good example of, like a godly person, arrogant and boastful and just whatever, lover of things,
money,
and
yeah.
possessions. And then in a more recent episode, they talked about someone who, not necessarily to that extent, not the best example still, but not as bad. So like they have pointed out different people and just like use them as an example of how to be a godly man.
Okay.
We can use older, like people in the congregation, an older individual who's a faithful Christian, and we might go to them for questions and answers, and just maybe try to emulate them a little because they're an outstanding example to you.
And I think that example is it's a really big, potentially Demetrius and Gaius were at the same congregation, and John's like, hey, Demetrius is a good example. Look to him, follow him. I mean, I'll tell you, early on in my teaching, Harold was a phenomenal example for me, and I always looked up to him in that regard. I was paired with an individual that was in education specifically at Ohio State that I partnered with in teaching early on at a different congregation. All right, now verse 12. As we're introduced to Demetrius in this single verse, I see three distinct groups that validate the good actions and the character of Demetrius. There might be some overlap in these groups, especially since the first one we see is everyone. The second group is truth itself. And finally, John says, we also. My assumption as to why John uses we is that he's including those traveling brethren that provided the good report of Gaius. We don't really know anything of Demetrius since this is the only mention of him in the New Testament. Given that Demetrius is presented as an example for Gaius to follow, there's reason to believe that Demetrius and Gaius were members of the same congregation. Taking assumptions or logic one step further regarding Demetrius, he also might have been the one bringing the letter to Gaius. This is speculation primarily by scholars looking at the construction of the Greek behind the phrase that you see in verse 12, hath good report of all men. Not that it matters a whole lot, but logically the scenario plays out like this. There was all this drama at Gaius's and potentially Demetrius's congregation about supporting some traveling evangelists. Gaius steps up and shows love, kindness, and hospitality to these traveling brethren. These brethren move on, potentially with Demetrius traveling with them. Ultimately, Demetrius and these traveling evangelists get back to John and give the good report to him of Gaius acting in love towards these travelers. John commends Gaius by this letter and sends it back to him in Demetrius's hands. A lot of assumptions there, none of which can be substantiated within the New Testament itself. The second group, or about the middle of verse 12, we see the truth itself. This, of course, is a reference to God's Word. Demetrius not only had a good reputation among men, but also lived a life pleasing to God and in line with the teaching of the New Testament. The last section, where John includes himself by using we or us, John, when speaking of his own testimony, took great care and honor in being true. He alludes to his telling and testifying of the truth in his gospel account, especially as it relates to our Lord's death, burial, and resurrection. You see phrases like this in both chapters 19 and 21 of his gospel account. We're going to run out of time. We'll pick up in some other short book the next time we meet. Thanks, everyone.